Okay, great. I have just 2 minutes past 7 Eastern. Looks like we have a good crowd coming through and get started. Welcome everyone to the ACPMP Educational Program Series. Very happy to have you. My name is Deborah Shelton. I'm the Executive Director for the Appendix Cancer Pseudomonadism Research Foundation. Tonight, we're very, very pleased to have as our guest speaker, Dr. Anai Kothari. He's going to be talking to us about clinical trials. His presentation is titled Understanding Clinical Trials and How They Fit in Treating Appendix Cancer. First, just a brief message about ACPMP and our mission, and a couple of brief housekeeping notes, and then we'll jump right in. I'll introduce Dr. Kothari. So for those of you who have participated in our program previously, welcome back. Pleasure to have you. Thank you for your support. And for those of you that are new, welcome to you. Happy you could join us. We try to meet once a month or so. And what we typically do is we identify topics of interest to the appendix cancer community, and we get guest subject matter experts to come and present to us. And so that's what we'll be doing tonight. Brief reminder about ACPMP. We're a nonprofit organization, and our core mission is really twofold. One, we fund and support promising research to find additional meaningful treatments for appendix cancer with the hope of one day finding a cure. And two, we fund and support educational programs for physicians, patients, caregivers, and families so that we can all stay informed about this rare cancer and increase awareness. All of this work is made possible solely through the generosity of all of your donations. So we're very, very grateful to our community and each and every dollar. Now, by way of brief housekeeping, a couple of things. One, we did get a pretty good number of questions through the registration process. So we start our Q&A session later this evening already with a good number. However, we will also try to get to other questions. What you could do if you have any, as Dr. Kothari is presenting, is just submit those through the Q&A window at the bottom of your screen. And the second thing I want to tell you is that your lines are muted to reduce background noise. The third thing is that this presentation is being recorded, and it will be immediately available for playback to all of you who are registered. You could access that through the same link that you would have gotten when you registered. For all others, we will eventually post it. However, that may take several days, but stay tuned. And last but not least, if you have any questions, need some more information about our educational series, if you have thoughts about topics that you would like to see in future webinars, I've got my contact information right there for you. Feel free to reach out to me at any time. It's Deborah, S-D-E-B-O-R-A-H, S as in Sam, at acpmp.org. Okay, now with all that business out of the way, it is my pleasure to introduce to you our guest speaker, Dr. Kothari. Dr. Kothari is an assistant professor in the Division of Surgical Oncology, Department of Surgery, and a member of the Collaborative for Healthcare Delivery Science at the Medical College of Wisconsin. He grew up in Manitowoc, Wisconsin, and received his BS and MD at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Dr. Kothari completed his general surgery training at Loyola University Medical Center, where he also earned a master's degree in epidemiology. This was followed by a fellowship in complex general surgical oncology at the University of Texas MD Anderson Cancer Center. Dr. Kothari's clinical expertise is the surgical treatment of upper gastrointestinal cancer and advanced cancers of the GI tract. He is a member of several national societies, including the Society of Surgical Oncology, the American College of Surgeons, and the Society of Asian Academic Surgeons. He is an active researcher with a focus on using advanced analytics to improve cancer care. Kothari, we're so happy and fortunate to have you tonight, and the floor is all yours.
Well, we may have to make do with this. I earlier was joking that I wore the same suit as my profile picture, and I guess I could do that without being culpable to everyone. But I'll do this for now, and then as long as this is okay, we can do this, and we can kind of go from there. Are you all able to? Is my screen sharing okay now?
Yes, it is. I see your screen and I hear you.
Okay, all right. Let's do this, and maybe my camera will find its way to start working somewhere in the middle. So first and foremost, I'm just so honored to have the opportunity to speak to you all this evening, and thanks, Deborah, for that introduction. I already used my joke about my suit, so I guess I'll get kind of straight into the presentation and an overview of the topic that we've been working on discussing so far. One of the things that I think is really important about this topic specifically is that I think it's a really challenging entry point once we're thinking about clinical trials. And really what I want to hopefully do for all you this evening is just to give a sense of what does the overall scope of clinical trials look like in a very broad sense. And so while I want to have some focus on appendiceal cancers, I think kind of the beginning is really just to get a broad overview of what clinical trials are, what they're intended to do, and then without getting into too many of the specifics of any of the ongoing and open trials that are appendiceal disease focused, but instead kind of navigate and wayfind through what I think is a very difficult process or a difficult topic at times. The first thing I want to do before I get in is just acknowledge the team that we have here at the Medical College of Wisconsin. We have 4 faculty members, all who are experts and trained in surgical oncology that treat appendix cancer as well as other diseases of the peritoneum. We have an amazing program manager in Maggie Lawston, and 3 advanced practice practitioners who really keep things running. And I often say Jenny Merrill, who I work with the most, is really an international authority on this disease. She's been here through at least 3 different eras of surgeons. And when you talk about someone who knows this disease and probably more importantly, the overall journey that goes into this, there's no one quite like her. The talk tonight, really, I wanted to go through a few kind of overarching bullet points, like I mentioned. The first is really just, what actually is a clinical trial? The second thing is, how have trials up until now really shaped appendix cancer treatment? I think it's really important just to know the context of what trials have done to really guide how this is managed currently. The next is just understanding clinical trials. There's lots of phases, lots of regulation. The process is quite burdensome, and I will be very honest with you all. I wouldn't consider myself a clinical trialist. There's some who have many open trials of their own who've been doing this a lot. One of the reasons I wanted to talk about this specifically, actually this topic specifically with you all, is I think sometimes the message when you get it from someone who's also trying to make sure that they fully understand and grasp it, and hasn't been so far along that it's difficult for them to maybe relate to where you're at, especially getting going in this area. And probably many of you actually know and experience this in a way that I couldn't possibly have the expertise to talk about as well. But it's really just, can we understand clinical trials at a very basic level, and then be able to launch it from there. How did the trials happen? What are the component steps to do so? And then maybe one of the questions that my patients ask me more often than any when it comes to clinical trials, which is, when should we start actually thinking about clinical trial? When is it relevant to be considering it? And then finally, I'm going to end just by, I've already tested technology once today, but we'll try again, which is navigating trials, and really a primer to just walk through in real time websites like actually ACPMP's website, clinicaltrials.gov, and just the relevant parts of that website, because it's a little overwhelming, just the design of those websites themselves for someone just kind of getting to do it for the first time. And then of course we'll end with a question and answer session, hopefully be able to address many topics that are on those who've joined this evening's minds. I always like to start any talk I give or anything just with some basic definitions. We're all kind of coming at it from the same place. And I chose 3 different definitions to put in front of you, just because they all are slightly different, but ultimately describe clinical trials in a very similar way. The first is just the NIH definition. And this is the National Institutes of Health. And they define clinical trials as a research study where one or more human subjects are prospectively assigned to one or more interventions. So this is basically from the time someone enrolls in a trial moving forward, that's when they're going to be observed. And what the goal is really to evaluate the impact on an outcome, whether it's biomedical, behavioral. There's actually a broad range of potential things we're looking at when we're talking about clinical trials. And it's based on an intervention of some kind. That can be a treatment, pill, type of operation, but it kind of leads this in a very broad sense of what a trial actually is. The World Health Organization has a trial definition that's similar, but adds a little bit more breadth to the idea of what an intervention actually is. So they define it as something that's not restricted to drugs necessarily, but are inclusive of a wide range of interventions. And I think this is really important because oftentimes when we think about clinical trials, it's really along the realm of this is a treatment that we're offering compared to something else, but the intervention itself actually can be something like preventative care or screening, and I'll talk a little bit about that further into the talk. And then, Deborah mentioned that one of my interests is using advanced analytic tools, and I was kind of smile now because ChatGPT has become so profoundly part of kind of the consciousness of where we're at right now. And we've been doing some work in our lab thinking about language models even beforehand. But I think sometimes, you can, this is not advocating by any means for using this as a primary source of information. And now that we're recording the webinar, I should really say that. But I actually think in this case, it did a pretty good job, which is that these are carefully designed and controlled studies, human participants being a key part of this definition, and it's really to evaluate safety, efficacy, and benefits of an intervention. So I mentioned that I wanted to put in context for you all where clinical trials and appendix cancer's relationship has been to date. And this is now looking at the last time our group got together in consensus. Many of you may recognize these guidelines or have heard about them from your providers that kind of are a guide for the decision-making around the treatment of appendix cancer. And there's these guidelines similar to the national NCCN guidelines or other similar type approaches, just provide some standardization of how we think about the problems that you all and your families are potentially dealing with. And I don't put this up to add complexity, but instead I wanted to just point out a couple places where clinical trials have been really important in actually guiding some of these breakpoints or branches to say, okay, these are maybe how we should approach this particular problem. So actually one of the first trials centered around this box here, which is in the setting of individuals where incomplete cytoreduction was predicted based on either clinical or imaging findings. And now the recommendation is to consider systemic therapy, chemotherapy being most often the one that's offered for a period of time, usually 3 to 6 months. When I first looked at the consensus and we were talking about this particular decision, it was, well, how do we advise the community in this circumstance? And actually, interestingly enough, it was based on a phase 2 trial, and I'll go through the phases a little bit later in the talk, from the mid 2000s. And their rationale for doing this trial really is that they recognized PMP is often considered at this time to be resistant to systemic chemotherapy. And there had not been really much done to figure out, well, can chemotherapy work in certain circumstances when potentially at this time in the early to mid 2000s, there weren't any other good options. And so they conducted this phase 2 trial, and the goals of the trial were really to evaluate tumor response, survival, toxicity, and quality of life. I think really very well ahead of their time in terms of the types of things that they were thinking about with this trial. They used a combination of actually IV mitomycin and IV capecitabine as the choice of drug. That's MCAP chemotherapy. And, you know, like I had mentioned earlier, I don't want to get too much into the really nitty gritty of the results of these trials, but instead just kind of from a broader context, what they allowed us to learn. And I highlighted 2003 to 2006 because, you know, that's, 15 plus years ago that we're using basically to guide many of the decisions that we make right now on a day-to-day basis. And you can see kind of the pre-treatment to post-treatment. They've shown this in their paper, essentially demonstrating that there could be benefit even in a situation which previously was thought not to be responsive to chemotherapy, that there can be some benefit from this dual agent approach. I'll also highlight that 40 patients. So the contribution of these 40 patients really in the overall way in the paradigm that we treat appendix cancer, instrumental, monumental. I mean, it have helped a lot of people, and through their contribution in this clinical trial, we're able to, pass forward that knowledge to help a lot of individuals that came after them. The words on the slide get a little small, but I just boxed out a couple of areas, which is the cytoreductive surgery and IP chemotherapy recommendations that are part of this pathway. Because, as many of you know, thinking about the right choice of perfusion agent, the right approach to cytoreductive surgery is another very important and well-studied area. And actually the first trial in the United States around appendix cancer was done by Ed Levine and colleagues. This was 3 sites done over 6 years and accrued 121 patients into the trial. And this wasn't looking at anything about efficacy, wasn't looking at how well cytoreductive surgery and HIPEC worked for this disease, but instead was focused on thinking about the agent, the drug, and the toxicity related to it. So again, clinical trials come in a lot of different flavors, and what they're trying to maybe look at and understand can be different trial to trial. And this trial really demonstrated a couple things. Importantly, it was the safety of these 2 different perfusion agents, the doses across a broad population. And then maybe perhaps even more importantly than anything, is it sets the stage for the ability in the United States to do a trial across multiple sites in this disease and be able to successfully see it from start to finish. And again, 121 patients, this was published in 2017, and just immense contributions from their participation in this trial. And then I'll leave one more trial just because I think it is just so important and really guides a lot of the way we think about not just appendiceal cancer, but other diseases of the peritoneum. This was a trial that outside of the United States, and there was an open question for a long time about should we just treat peritoneal-based disease with chemotherapy alone? And this was specifically related to colorectal cancer, but as many of you know, the data and kind of the trials around colorectal cancer oftentimes will be taken on and used to guide the treatment of appendix cancer. And again, a relatively small number of patients, 105, randomized in this case to 2 different groups, surgery and HIPEC versus IV chemotherapy alone. And what was found was a substantial benefit in median survival and overall survival related to the inclusion of cytoreductive surgery and HIPEC beyond just systemic chemotherapy alone. So again, now very well selected patient population. There's can go into, we can probably spend a whole hour talking about this trial in particular, but I think the bottom line and the thing I want you all to take away from kind of these 3 trials that I've shown isn't necessarily what those trials are showing, though quite important, but instead how they factor into the decision-making on a day-to-day basis of providers and patients and their families in treating appendix cancer and other diseases as well. So if I haven't convinced you already, let me know. I can find a few other examples, but clinical trials really do impact how appendix cancer is treated. And that's, I think, one of the main reasons why I think it's so important to try to understand some of the often mystery that kind of goes into clinical trials and what they mean. So I'm going to keep this slide up for a second while I just kind of talk for a second, because this website I think is just so good. It's put on by the NC, the National Cancer Institute. They have many open trials, but do an excellent job of thinking through how to communicate the process, which is going from new diagnosis or somewhere in the middle of the cancer treatment journey to thinking about clinical trials. And the website itself offers a lot of really great resources, many of which I've either adopted into my clinical practice, adapted into this presentation, or have thought about in the context of, how do we make sure we're communicating these things when patients and their families ask our team about them. I put clinical trials 101 with the question mark, partly because I think this is probably a little bit beyond true 101. But anyways, if you saw my face, you'd see that I was smiling. And the other hard thing about webinars, as many of you know, is right now I'm just like talking to my empty room, and my jokes are be less funny or interesting. I may make Deborah every now and then give me some positive feedback. Okay, so let me just go back. So one more time, really great website. I think one that you'll, for those that are thinking about this, I think a really important resource. So I talk a lot about this, and it's the journey. And this disease is one where it's probably more relevant than nearly any other when you're thinking about the overarching way that this is navigated. And it starts, of course, with diagnosis in the most simplistic way, moving on to treatment. And then, our goal is to move towards surveillance. And it's not a line, right? This isn't just point A to point B, but Microsoft PowerPoint doesn't have a graphic that shows a squiggly line that oftentimes has a few circles in the middle of it. But, I think when I talk about clinical trials, I want to put it in context of this journey. And the things that are always kind of on the side or are companions to this are things like prevention, screening, and undoubtedly the thing that we think about probably not enough, but should think about way more, which is quality of life. And I don't mean that to say, supportive care, et cetera, but instead just as you're going through this journey, or family members are going through this journey, or patients that you take care of are going through this journey, it's recognizing that time is so different from the provider standpoint than what's happening to the patients and their families, because anyways, I can talk a lot about that, but quality of life is a very broad and very important thing, and something that clinical trials do address. And when we think about clinical trials in the context of that journey, the first, and I think the one that comes immediately to mind, are the treatment trials. These are the trials which are designed to answer the questions like, what's a safe dose? Should we actually give this new treatment or not? Does the new treatment help people with cancer live longer? What's the impact on survival? What's the impact on relapse-free survival? Can the tumor be shrunk with the treatment that we're offering in this trial? Can it prevent it from spreading to new places? And can this treatment prevent the tumor from coming back? So when we think about cancer treatment trials, I think more often than not, this is the type of trial that immediately comes to mind and is the one that most are seeking or most are interested in are the treatment trials. But clinical trials don't start and stop there. And as I've mentioned, there's a few others that I think are really important to recognize. There's something called a prevention trial. So these are also clinical trials structured and governed in the exact same way as treatment trials. The difference being that they're trying to prevent basically someone from going from, I don't know why I picked the graphic Superman, but from Superman to not. And there's ways that this is done through either action studies where you actually do something, physical activity, mental health focused interventions, or agent type studies where it's treating with things like supplements or other drugs where there's a thought that they can actually be preventative. I think this is, especially in appendix cancer, becomes quite relevant when we're thinking about the time period after cytoreductive surgery and HIPEC, for example. And those very difficult and very challenging parts of the journey, which is the surveillance part. Are there trials that could be in that space that kind of think about prevention? Screening trials being another important paradigm or type of clinical trial. These are really centered around new ways to find disease early, where it might be more easily treated. This is a huge area of interest for a lot of people and has really changed a lot in terms of other disease sites like breast cancer therapy and colorectal cancer more generally. Colonoscopy, mammography being kind of obvious examples of screens that have made an impact ultimately on disease detection and early treatment. The other thing that these trials do is ask the question of, if we're going to put people through screening, and prostate cancer, I think, is a good example of this, where PSA, prostate-specific antigen testing was ubiquitous for a long time. And the question then became, well, should we be doing this to everyone because there might be actual risk to screening? So these trials try to interrogate those questions as well. And if you haven't figured it out already, I'm really passionate about this aspect, which is the quality of life piece and quality of life trials and what they may represent from the standpoint of once treatment is ongoing or treatment is completed, or as someone is leading up to their treatment, are there ways that we can manage these things as they're happening? Pain management, nutrition. I'm just about to open a sleep-specific study here, actually, symptoms. And then how does cancer actually impact not just the patients themselves, but their support system? And then after, we're all, like I said, aiming for that surveillance period. It's also, a very relevant and important time period where we have to think about quality of life and what kind of goes into that. So there's a lot of interest in this area and some trials that are now being designed specifically to focus on this beyond purely the treatment or interventional trials that I think are the more common type that people think about when we think about clinical trials. So on one hand, there's the types of trials themselves. On the other, it's the various phases of clinical trial. And I was quizzed about this when I was in undergrad. I was quizzed about this as a medical student. I was quizzed about this when I became a resident. I'll tell you, I still have to look this up. And I think it's important to know, especially when you're thinking about clinical trials, where they are from a phase standpoint and what the intention of those phases are. But sometimes it's hard to memorize exactly what happens at each one. And there is some overlap between the two, but I'll try to talk about 3 phases, the ones that are typically the ones that when we're talking about appendix cancer specifically, these are the phases of trials that we're thinking about. There's a 4th phase, which is interestingly phase 4, which is mostly post-market evaluation. I'm not going to go too far into that. So there's of course a phase 0. So, like what happens is someone comes up with phase 1, 2, 3, 4, and then realizes, oh, there should be something else. So they make phase 0. And I've just heard one of the cooperative groups, and these are groups that actually help coordinate clinical trials more broadly, are starting to think about phase -1. So, I can give this talk again in a year and add that in. But The idea of phase 0 trials is this is really a small number of participants, 10 to 15. The dosing of the drug or whatever intervention is actually intended on purpose to not be therapeutic in its dosing. So the aim is to go low. The goal, though, is for there to be gathered information about the behavior. How is it going to be processed in the body? What's going to be some of the toxicities that we need to be looking out for as we, expand this? What are some of the early data on preliminary drug effects? And then this is really drug development. And this primarily is happening typically actually in pharmaceutical company driven trials where they have a candidate target drug and want to understand, from a developmental standpoint, what this will look like. Then there's phase 1. Phase 1 is all about safety. So in this phase of trial, which usually takes about 5 to 7 months, sometimes longer than that, the idea is a smaller group of patients, in some cases healthy volunteers, but more often than not, they are individuals who either have a condition that's consistent with the target, but isn't exactly that. And it's a small number, 20 to 100 patients that are enrolled in that trial. And they gradually increase the dose over time to make sure that the study can be looked at different doses. So when I talk about phase 1 trials to patients, I really say that the goal here is not efficacy. Phase one trials aren't necessarily going to be looking at are you going to actually benefit from the drug itself, though there can be some information about that, but instead are really trying to figure out safety of the drug and how it potentially might work. Phase 2 trials, on the other hand, now are getting into effectiveness. So these are the trials where really the goal is to understand, can this drug actually work for the target condition? And no longer are we talking about volunteers that are either healthy or are at risk of a condition, but instead these are actually meant to understand, is this drug going to work for the target condition itself? So I would say when it comes to appendix cancer, most of the trials that we're talking about are phase 2 trials. These are larger groups of patients with a target condition. The aim is to aim in the hundreds in terms of the numbers that are accrued and enrolled. And they're setting the stage for phase 3, which is identifying the optimal condition upon which the treatment or the intervention works for that target condition. Get a better understanding of safety, get a better understanding of what the implication is going to be from a monitoring standpoint once it's been put into play. And so that's really what phase 2 is intended to do. And like I mentioned, because of the nature of appendix cancer, many of the trials that we talk about are either phase 1 or phase 2, whereas phase 3 now is really getting into the larger scale studies that are comparing the current investigational treatment against a standard of care. So these are typically randomized controlled trials where there's an offer of either the intervention versus standard of care treatment. The idea here is a large number of patients, 100 to thousands, depending on what the outcome that's being investigated actually is. And the dose itself is based on what was learned from phase 1 and phase 2. Phase 3 trials are long and they take years to complete. Earlier in the presentation, I presented a few trials, one of which is a randomized trial, and it took multiple years, not just the time period of accruing and getting the data, but actually from the time of conception all the way through running it across 3 different sites that participated is a decade-long process. And so phase 3 trials, especially in rare cancers, are slow, but they do, when executed and resulted, make substantial impact on the condition. Clinical trials across the phases don't happen without a trial team. And as you start thinking about clinical trials and the relevance of them in the treatment of appendix cancer, really, to me, I think there's kind of 4 main players. The first is a principal investigator. This is oftentimes a clinician, someone who has an idea or a concept in mind that then gathers a group together to come up with, okay, how do we actually turn this into something that can be meaningful? There's oftentimes at least one, if not more, research nurses and data coordinators who actually are, when I talk about who's doing the hard work of the trial, beyond the patient, the family, it's the clinical research coordinator, the research nurse. And actually, I'm going to advise this a little bit later on, but when you're thinking about actually getting on or enrolling or understanding the nuances and the details of a trial that looks interesting or may align with your goals of care, don't talk to the principal investigator. You know, the point of contact and the person who knows more about the nitty-gritty of the trial itself is the research nurse, the research coordinator. The data manager is someone that is very, very important, and they're the ones that are actually managing the information that's coming through the trial, monitoring for adverse events, keeping track of the information so that it can subsequently be used for additional analyses. And I think a very important thing, which oftentimes is under recognized, is the data center and management system for a lot of trials will allow that information to come back to the patient themselves. So all that extra that's happening as part of the clinical trial and the care that's provided through the trial, sometimes can feel like all that information is just one direction, from clinical trial participant to those that are actually coordinating the trial. And actually the data manager and the team has the ability in nearly all trials to provide that back to help guide not just that individual's care, but potentially others. And then there's oftentimes many co-investigators or other collaborators, whether it's at that site or other sites, who are actually helping ensure that the trial is being executed the way it's supposed to, and monitoring for safety, et cetera. So ever since I guess it's X now, or X, formerly known as Twitter. Ever since some of the information about this webinar started going out, I got a lot of questions about this. Actually, I think that this is, and even before this, is kind of top of mind. Is when should we start actually thinking about clinical trial? And I probably shouldn't admit this out loud, but that answer is a very difficult question to answer. I think that the best time is right from the start, but there's so much going on, at the time of diagnosis. And I think that oftentimes there can be some guilt about not thinking about clinical trials at that time point later on. And so what I will say is that thinking about clinical trials can happen at any time along the journey. And just because it wasn't something that may have been front of mind earlier on during the treatment pathway, isn't something to feel guilty about, or as if an opportunity was lost. But I think this is a really tough question to answer. The Chicago Consensus Guidelines, I've now referenced these a couple of times just because I do think that they're good, and was a participant when we put some of these things together. But the place where clinical trial comes up is in two places, and it actually kind of makes clinical trials seem like something to do when nothing else is working. And I think that unfortunately is a way that many people think about clinical trials. I'll just zoom in on this a little bit. Is that this is, and these trials are meant for when everything else hasn't gone right, and things aren't going the right direction, and now it's time to start thinking about trials as a place of hope, but recognizing that, and I think that is something that we, and hopefully during this webinar, it can change a little bit of that perception. I think some of that, to be honest, and I took this from the cancer.gov website, so I can put this out a little bit there too, but I do truly believe this is true, and that there are just some situations where treating physicians may not be aware of the trials that could be appropriate for you specifically, or a family member, or someone else that you're taking care of. And the reason for that is not ignorance or fear, or it's just there are so many trials, and navigating clinical trials in and of itself is quite an arduous task. And many clinicians know the trials that might be happening at their own institution, but may not be fully aware of the full spectrum, even around disease sites that they treat nearly every day. So I think that there's 2 points of advice here. One is that I think getting a second opinion, period, is super important. And I encourage anyone that I take care of that should be part of what they're thinking about. But and it should never be a violation of trust that that's something that these are very difficult things. So that's part one, is thinking about just, so there may be another care provider that has insight that that someone else doesn't, and that's totally fine. The other is that there are resources. So cancer.gov actually has a clinical trial guide and a phone number that you can call into, and they actually have navigators free of charge to help identify potential trials that match up. But I think the most important part of this is self-advocacy. And I never want to put this back on someone else, but at the end of the day, there's one person who knows the most about themselves, and that's you, or whoever is dealing with the problem, family, and close support system in place. And I'll show you a guide of the information that is important to gather as you're thinking about clinical trials from the beginning, to help just navigate this what I think is a pretty complex world. So I talked about the journey already, and all the parts that kind of go into it, and the things that we're thinking about within each. But I think question one is, when should I start thinking about clinical trials? And it's at any one of the points of the journey, so to speak, whether it's immediately before diagnosis, after diagnosis, in the middle of treatment, during surveillance, thinking about family members and prevention, screening. I've talked about quality of life a few times. I think at every point in this journey, clinical trials could be relevant. And I think it's worth thinking about. Not that there's you have enough to think about already, but I think at every one of those stages, I think that there's an opportunity to at least to have these things on your mind, or to be thinking about them for someone that you're caring for that might be walking this journey. As you're weighing, whether clinical trials are something to pursue, I think there's 2 facets to this. There's the benefits and the risks, and I'll go through the benefits first and then go through the risks. The benefits are the ones that oftentimes the clinical trialists, those that really encourage clinical trials, focus on, which is here's access to potentially a new treatment. This is not something that's available outside of the trial, and so it might be something that otherwise there isn't the ability to get unless you're part of a clinical trial. And there's many examples of that within appendiceal cancer treatment. One of the benefits, and this is actually something that is a secondary benefit, is there's this close monitoring by the research team when you're on a clinical trial. Clinical trials are really carefully regulated because of the need to ensure safety throughout the course of the trial. This is especially relevant in phase 2 and phase 3 trials. And what that means is there can be additional touch points with the care team, more testing that's done. And a secondary benefit of that in some ways is just more contact with your care team and the ability to potentially find problems that otherwise may have been unrecognized sooner. There's actually just published a trial in ovarian cancer which showed that individuals that were on trial versus not in the setting of recurrent ovarian cancer actually had slightly better survival. I think a large part because of this extra monitoring that goes into what happens when someone's on a study or on a trial. There's a potential for early benefit. So we know as things are coming out, or there's new and more promising therapies, and I think immunotherapy is one of these areas where we've seen more change and improvement. And I'm not talking about appendix cancer specifically, but across the realm of cancer therapy. And the early enrollees in some of those trials did get to see that benefit earlier than when it eventually turned into standard of care. And I think one of the things that we don't often talk about is this idea of contribution to scientific knowledge. And more I'm learning that is something that my patients and their families really feel is a very important part of their cancer treatment overall. It's not just to help themselves and what's immediately in front of them, but can whatever's happening to them be a guide for someone else. And I think it's just a really powerful and a kind of an inspirational thing that I didn't expect to find. And then, like I said, I give you the risks. And just as there can be access to new treatment, that new treatment might not be as good as what the standard is once the trial is done and we learn more about it. One of the things that a trial is trying to figure out is what are the side effects of a new treatment, and we can find things that are unexpected or potentially worse from a side effects profile standpoint than other. I gave you a pretty long explanation for why more frequent doctor visits are better. I love seeing my patients as much as possible. But on the flip side, there's a huge burden to additional care, which is travel, housing, childcare. And I'll talk about what that means from the financial aspects of clinical trial enrollment, because it's a very, very relevant part of all of this discussion. There is a requirement for extra tests. So biopsies, additional blood draws. These are things that can be uncomfortable, time consuming. They come with sometimes risk as well. So these are all things that are risks that are part of the clinical trial itself. And like I mentioned, I think cost, oftentimes, something that we don't all fully understand as well as we should. I'm a huge, I'm a pretty big violator of this, but understanding the costs of what actually is happening is really important. It's like a nice segue into it, kind of the next part of what I wanted to discuss, which is safety, cost, and logistics. So first, are clinical trials safe? And this has to be the first, second, and third question we all ask ourselves when we're talking about clinical trials, especially if the background against which we're measuring something new is a well-proven standard of care. Better make sure that the trial itself is safe. So I think these are all questions that someone who's enrolling in a clinical trial must ask of the clinical trial team. And while most trials, like I said, are very, very well regulated, that regulation is happening one space past where the interaction is between the person that's participating and actually who's delivering the trial. And so just as it's really important to develop a very personal relationship with your individual care team, I think it's just as important to have a really specific interaction and understanding of your clinical trial team, and to ask the questions, what are the hazards or downsides? Who is watching out for any problems? Who is overseeing the safety and well-being of all participants in the study? And what exactly is the goal of the trial in terms of the question that it's trying to answer? And while each of these, I'll talk through a little bit of the steps to getting a trial going, are important parts of that process, I think it's really critical to actually have that discussion one-on-one with those who are enrolling you into a clinical trial or someone in your family. So I want to talk to you all about it the way that I know about it, which is the way we do it here at the Frederick Medical College of Wisconsin. So we have just an incredible clinical trials office, and it's led by Ray Kurzrug, who I really do think is one of the premier thought leaders in precision oncology and rare cancers. And we're fortunate to have her join our team here in 2021, and is a staunch advocate of precision-based clinical trials and has really grown a lot of our trial portfolio here in the short time that she's been here. Ben George, who I work with a tremendous amount, and then Samim Abedin, who specializes in non-solid tumors. But these are true experts, and the reason I'm talking about them so much is I am confident that every clinical trials office at institutions where clinical trials are being offered have this kind of expertise that's guiding the clinical trial process. And so I think that office is designed in a way to ensure that the people that are going to be enrolled in trials are safe, and that they're going to make a difference in a way that we want them to. So what happens here is oftentimes the trial starts with a concept. So it's the idea of what can we achieve with this clinical trial? And usually that's initiated by a principal investigator who ultimately eventually becomes the PI of a specific clinical trial. And the next step really is protocol development. Now, this can happen at the institution itself, so that trial can be conducted by investigators within a single institution. Oftentimes, these are phase 0, 1, or 2 trials, just because it's hard to expand to phase 3 without more than one center. Or alternatively, it can be something called a cooperative group trial, which is conducted and coordinated in a multi-institutional way by groups like the National Cancer Institute, or SWOG, which is a cancer-specific cooperative group. So there's 2 ways a protocol can actually happen. One is from the investigator themselves, and we call it an investigator-initiated trial, or it can be a largest scale cooperative group trial, which is at multiple different centers. And what that means is that for someone who's interested in a multi-center trial or cooperative group, there may be many different sites where they can actually enroll on the trial and get treated on that trial. The flip side, though, is for an IIT, investigator initiated, usually that trial only is happening at the site the investigator is at. There's, of course, exceptions to both of those, but that's generally how I think about it. So once that protocol is reviewed carefully, and this is the case for a large cooperative group, drug or pharmacy sponsored trial, or an investigator initiated trial, at least here at our institution, that then gets passed along to the scientific review committee. This is a committee here that's made up of about 18 individuals, and all with varying different levels of expertise. And what happens is every protocol, and sometimes this would be the most painful thing for anyone to participate in watching, but sometimes I wish people would actually see the discussions that we have part of our SRC here. It's really the most nuanced review of these protocols. I mean, we're talking about exactly how long and how much that trial is going to be impacting patients, what the adverse events are going to look like. Every word is turned over to make sure that there's no concern of a safety piece to the trial, and then there's scientific validity to it. Once the scientific review committee feels that this is a trial that is at least scientifically meritorious, then that moves to the institutional review committee, which is the IRB, the institutional review board, and they are just reviewing it for actually the process of when a person is enrolled on that trial, to make sure that that is per protocol, and that there's protections around that. After that approval happens, then it goes to safety and data review. Again, one more checkpoint. And then there's post-trial implementation, oversight, and assessment as well. And like I said, most institutions, I shouldn't say most, all institutions that are conducting trials likely have something very similar to this, multiple different steps to ensure that the trial is scientifically sensible, that it makes sense, that it's answering an important question, but and then also is going to make sure that there's safety parameters around it. I mentioned that I was going to talk about safety first, and then I was going to talk about cost, and so I'll transition a bit to that, because these things cost money, and running a new trial involves potentially new treatments, drug costs, additional tests, and what of that comes down to what enrollee and their families need to potentially take on versus what should be expected of an insurer or insurance plan, and what should be expected by the research team itself. To me, a clinical trial, when it comes to the direct things that are related to the trial, patient care costs and research costs should not incur any additional to the patients or their families. There's one slide after this where there are some costs that aren't captured within these 2 categories, which are really relevant and have to be considered. But for these, additional doctor visits, if there's a hospital stay related to a complication from a trial, if there are standard cancer treatments that are offered after the trial is done or before, if there's things from a symptom standpoint that need to be addressed that are happening on the trial, additional labs, imaging, all this should be covered by insurance, and actually usually is. And now, having dove through insurance plans with very, very fine detail, They all do have some indicator or provisions around this. This is the one place, and I almost never speak positively about health insurance, but this is the one place where I'll say that I actually think that they do a pretty good job. Okay, I just scratch that for recording. Okay, and then the research costs, which oftentimes will be covered by the trial or through the company that makes the study drug. So, like I said, these are things that I think a lot of people worry about, and I want to provide some reassurance that at least these costs or should be covered by either the trial or insurance. But what is the intangible part of participating in a trial usually isn't talked about, and that's things like childcare, the time that's spent on the trial doing all the additional tests, because nearly every trial comes with more than just the standard of care. Additional things like food, travel, because some will look out for trials that are not within their hometown or nearby because they have a specific mutation, or they feel comfortable with the investigator and want to be a part of that care team. And so there's travel that goes with that. And while there's programs that can help with some of these things, generally speaking, the trials themselves or the insurers don't address these additional factors. And I just listed these 4 here because they're important, but also because these are the really nice icons that I could find. But there's a lot more than this, of course, that come into play. Medicare, if you go into Medicare's documentation, it's never this simple. But they actually do have a publication and a brochure, and that's the website that I have there, which is, what does it look like for Medicare? And so they break it down, part A and part B, what's routinely covered, and then what Medicare won't cover through part A and part B. And so they list it out, and every insurer, like I said, has some documentation like this. Like I said, I copied and pasted the most straightforward parts of the brochure that I could, but the details are very much available online, and that website can take you straight to the brochure. Okay, so navigating trials, and this I think is the part that is very personal and individualized, but I think that there's some steps that everyone can follow that allows for efficient moving through of this. I challenged technology earlier. I'm going to do it again in a bit, but I'll start by first saying that there's certain situations where personal advocacy is super important. I think clinical trials happens to be one of those, and part of it isn't because I think the treatment teams don't want to help. I think part of it is that the number of trials that are out there and the number of individual and personal things that are involved with this sometimes makes that connection difficult. So cancer.gov has what's called a cancer details checklist. We have adopted something like this here at our institution, very similar data that's gathered. We just don't have it in a form like this. It's electronic. And what it's meant to do is at any time during that journey to keep track of what would be important from an inclusion and exclusion criteria standpoint for trials that could potentially be that you or your family member could be eligible for. So the questions are, what cancer do you have? When did it start? Where did it start? Cell type? Just things that are important specifically for the individual to know, so that when then you go to look at the various resources that I'm about to show you, you have a sense of, okay, these are the things that are relevant to me, and then this trial has these criteria. Okay, it makes sense. I can be eligible for this. Okay, this is interesting. Or, okay, no, I can't do that. I don't meet the criteria for this. I can move on from that. So I'm amazed, and Deborah didn't put this in the talk. But I'm just amazed by what ACPMP has done to actually support clinical trial wayfinding for appendix cancer. I think in rare tumors like this, there is almost nothing more challenging than finding trials that are relevant and then working through the process. And I think that the ACPMP website does just an incredible job of allowing some of that wayfinding. So this is the website link. This is what it looks like when you first get there. This is just a screenshot that all these boxes are interactive. And it goes through by phase the trials that are specific to appendix cancer, those that have specificity to tumor mutational characteristics. And then there's an increasing number of trials now which fall into this larger realm of unspecified solid tumors, or there's specific mutations where it's disease agnostic, and instead it's focused on actually a drug that may target things about the disease itself. And so those trials were maybe you wouldn't think, oh, those are relevant for appendix cancer, but they could be, as appendix cancer being a type of solid tumor. Once you click on one of those blue boxes, this is what pulls down. So this is a trial that's being run on the NIH, and really very, very interesting trial. And this is specific for ovarian colorectal appendiceal peritoneal mesothelioma. And I just clicked on it not necessarily to endorse the trial or anything like that specifically, but instead just to talk through what does ACPMP have on the website, and what do these things mean. So of course, the location where this is happening, the description, baseline eligibility criteria, and the website does a pretty nice job of actually breaking down these as it relates to appendix cancer, and then the contact who I think sometimes we often forget that, like, if you've started a trial, you want people to reach out, you want people to be asking questions about it, you've spent a lot of time, as I mentioned, going through a long set of processes to get it to a place where it can be out there. And so I think that there's no shortage of interest in people reaching out. So anyway, so the contact that's listed, it usually wants people to reach out to them. But once you're on this, I know this is not the mouse that you normally, you'd click on this, and like I said, I was going to test technology, and it kind of goes to this website. So I'm going to try to do something. I don't know, maybe Deborah, you should put back on that nice welcome music because it was good. So this is clinicaltrials.gov. So we tested this earlier, so I'm going to assume it's working unless I see something in the chat or in the Q&A that's different where you can't see this. So what you should be seeing on your screen right now is clinicaltrials.gov. This is the legacy website. So of course, we're in the midst of clinicaltrials.gov changing what the website looks like, but I'll show you both versions. So once you click that website, once you click that link from ACPMP, for example, you get to this clinicaltrials.gov website, and you get the title of the trial, clinical trial identifier, recruitment status, when it was first posted, and when the last update about the trial was posted. I oftentimes tell people that the last update posted is a good indicator of how active the trial actually is. So some people open a trial, put it on clinicaltrials.gov, and then nothing really is happening with it. It's not accruing very quickly. And so the last update posted gives you a sense of, okay, is this active? Is it happening? If it's sooner, that's usually a good sign. And then it goes to the study details. I advise clicking the tabular view. I think it just makes looking at each of these things a little bit easier. And then goes to the outcomes. And then what's important for everyone to know here is, like I mentioned, you have put together this patient, your specific details of your cancer, and that gets into the eligibility criteria. And this is going to be the inclusion, exclusion for that trial specifically. And it's complicated, unfortunately, but don't be overwhelmed, I think is because as you read through bullet point by bullet point, even though there's a lot to kind of take in here, it all kind of aligns to things that you all for sure know about. Like I said, there's now a new, I think it's prettier, but doesn't make it any easier to navigate for someone who's been doing this for a while. But so it's still clinicaltrials.gov, and this is where you start on the home screen. And you have the ability to focus your search on a few conditions. Now, I think just starting from scratch here can be difficult because, for example, if you enter in appendix cancer and you hit search, you're going to get 75 studies, and many of these are not interventional trials. They're something called observational or even retrospective trials, where they're just characterizing things like the molecular profile of appendix cancers, how common are they. So now those are, don't get me wrong, interesting and important things, but I think less important probably for why most go on clinicaltrials.gov. Instead, what I would advise is going down to the filter on the left, and you have the ability to choose the study phase, but probably more importantly, the interest is going to be in interventional. So you have the ability to narrow it down and apply the filter and can look at some of the trials that might be recruiting or open, for example, that would fit that particular condition. Again, pay attention to where the location is and who the people are that are accruing to it, but this is one way. Again, I think that this type of search often is quite difficult because you kind of get into this place where there's a lot of things here, and maybe it's not as well curated as someplace like ACPMP, which has already kind of done some of this work for you. But just to give you a sense of what the clinicaltrial.gov interface and website looks like, and then once you kind of click on one of these trials, this is the new view of the more graphically appealing view, which you still have the ability to hit table view, for example. And then the contacts and locations, I think, are a little bit easier to find here. I think this is a closed trial, which is why there's not the ability to look at someone for this. All right, so I'm going to come back over to the PowerPoint. I have a few more slides before we kind of hit Q&A, but we're getting close. Every cancer center has something similar, where you can actually, ours is not nearly as good as ACPMP. So actually, we probably need to take some lessons from how that's been structured. But, we have the ability to post the trials that are open at our institution. Some of these are like, this is a farm company sponsored phase 3 study with, patients that have a very specific mutation. But again, the ability to call the number. And again, this is not, while I think we do things really well here, you'll find something very similar to like this at most of the places where you or someone that is being treated. And then the most important thing, I mentioned this already, which is, you'll have two choices of who to contact. Andrew's great, and I'm sure it will actually would. I trust me, would love to hear from people that are interested in this trial. But if you want to get an answer quickly, I don't quote me on this because I actually don't know. But I would say more often than not, going directly to the study contact who's not the PI is typically, to me, the best way to get the most efficient response quickly. And they're the ones that do usually the screening in and out and can say with pretty ready ease, does this make sense? What's the burden that would go into it? What's the anticipation? And get into some of the details about it. So, I wanted to just, take a minute to think about some of my thoughts about this topic, kind of from a 30,000-foot view. And clinical trials, tremendously important. And the patients and families who consider and think about enrolling in clinical trials throughout their cancer care journey are doing a tremendous service, because while everything is being done to ensure safety and efficacy, there is this piece which we still don't know all the way, which is how is it going to turn out? And so I think that does need to be a really important part of consideration for trials of what is this going to mean. But I think that's a truly critical part of this, and something to think about. They provide scientific validation. We oftentimes will come up with an idea to say, okay, this drug we know interacts with this receptor, or this. People really struggle with sleep after cytoreductive surgery and HIPEC. there's a few on the call who I get messages from in the middle of the night, and sometimes won't answer because I'll read it and say, okay, go back to sleep. But they try to validate what we think about a problem related to this disease, and that's what clinical trials, and that's the place that they play in. And when I talk about sleep, like I mentioned, we're talking about a trial that we're going to launch here about sleep in cytoreductive surgery and HIPEX. I think it's important. I think you have to be informed, not just about the decision making around the trial, but the logistics. It provides access to new treatments, understanding that there are some risks to that as well. And it's all on this theme of continuous advancement, because like I mentioned, there are 40 patients who enrolled in that first phase 2 trial thinking about chemotherapy for PMP, and really changed kind of the face of the field in some ways. So again, I really very much appreciate the opportunity. I know there's a lot of questions. I joke with Deborah, I really dislike hearing myself talk for this long. So hopefully I have time to talk a bit about Q&A. And this is my email. Anytime, please feel free to reach out. I'm happy to help how I can. And even if I can't, I'll just tell you that I can't. But thanks again. And sorry that I can't do both talk and can't see me, but I am wearing a nice suit.
Thank you so much for Dr. Kothari. And Dr. Kothari did all the tech check before his presentation, and I did see him on the Zoom, and I can attest to the fact that he is wearing a very nice suit. So thank you very much. That was a lot of good information on a topic, as I said at the top of the meeting tonight, that we get just so many questions about for obvious reasons. And you actually, Dr. Kothari, did a great job answering many of the questions that we got as part of the registration. But that said, I do want to go back to at least just one or two, even though you did talk a little bit about it, just to make sure that those people that asked the question really heard it, because it's topics that we get questions about all the time. And I guess the main one is this, and as a patient advocate, I have the benefit of being able to be very, very frank. I hear personally from many patients and caregivers day in and day out that call for help finding clinical trials, because basically what they're told by their treating physician is, we can't do anything else for you, don't know what else that can be done, go find a clinical trial. And many of these patients, caregivers, don't get any other help in finding the clinical trial. So they do call us, which is great. For those of you on this call, I do try to help patients find clinical trials. Dr. Kothari, I was so amazed that you commented on the clinical trial repository on the website. I didn't know if you were aware of that. You're one of the few people that have ever commented on it, and it really means a lot, because I built that 4 or 5 years ago, and it was a lot of work. And I'm glad that somebody like you thinks that that it's halfway decent. So thank you. But the problem is that many patients. So I'm intrigued by this cancer.gov tool that can help patients kind of find help. Do you have any other suggestions, or do you have any other thoughts that you wanted to share about when patients are told by their physician, go find a clinical trial, like you had mentioned, getting a second opinion? I mean, what does that look like? Or do you recommend that they use the cancer.gov tool? It sounds like you endorse, loosely at least, calling ACPMP, looking at our repository. But is there something that's appropriate or not appropriate in your expertise to then ask that treating physician to get help with finding a clinical trial? Or is that just really not feasible because of workload and all of that? And I don't want to put you in a difficult position, but this is a real pain point for so many.
Yeah, it is the most important question, I think, when we think about trials, because it is oftentimes the answer to very difficult problems. I mean, humbly, I found myself in similar situations as a provider, as a clinician, and where we're struggling to come up with what's the next best step, and clinical trial feels like the right answer, because there is potential opportunity for trying something that we haven't tried before. So in those circumstances, what I would advise is a couple things. I think using every resource at your disposal is good, and ACPMP being one of those, I wholeheartedly endorse that. Cancer.gov being another good one. The other thing is actually reaching out, even if it's a trial that may not fit perfectly with the condition or the situation that you're dealing with. There's contact names and numbers for trials that are open, and an email, or usually it's an email now that they have that's listed, of just saying, I'm interested in potentially thinking about this trial. Would you be willing to talk to me about it? And they'll 100% respond, and they may say, yeah, we don't actually think that you'd fit this trial, but we can review what you've gone through up until now, and actually think about the clinical situation from that perspective. So sometimes I think we overstate how much our in is, so to speak. And when I say our, I mean us, clinician to clinician. I can call my buddy, or I can get you an opinion somewhere else. Sometimes it's actually more efficient and better to just reach out through the trial teams or those contacts and make that connection that way. So that's what I advise. Use all the resources. And if there's ever one circumstance not to be humble or shy, this is it. Just, it's so important. And most of us, I would say nearly all of us that treat this disease in particular, encourage that, it doesn't hurt feelings, or it doesn't violate trust or anything like that. I mean, it's a huge part of what you're dealing with. So yeah, that's kind of how I think about it.
That's tremendous. And I'm really glad that you said that about it doesn't hurt feelings. And because so many times people want to get a second opinion, but they're afraid to get a second opinion. They don't want to offend or upset their treating physician, because they're depending on the treating physician sometimes to, save their life. So, and what we usually say at ACPMP is, if they're really good, if they're expert, they're not going to be offended. Just what you said, Dr. Kothari. People understand, these physicians understand and know, and so that's great. So I hope everyone really takes that message to heart. Another question we get a lot, and we got this time, is about eligibility criteria. And you touched on this a bit in your presentation and your really excellent kind of walkthrough on what that clinicaltrials.gov search looks like. But can you just kind of speak a little bit more to it? So for example, we got a couple questions from people who had some preconditions or a history of other types of cancers, X number of years prior, that sort of thing. We got a question from someone who's outside of the US and wondering if they wanted to participate in a trial in the US or somewhere else other than their country, other than the logistical issues. Would that bar them? Can you just kind of, I know eligibility criteria is complex, but how does that work? I mean, what does that look like? The inclusion and exclusion, how should someone kind of navigate that, including with a medical doctor to help unpack some of it?
Yeah, I think the one thing I'll say is that every clinical trial is N of one. It's set up slightly differently, and on purpose in some ways. It's meant to try to ensure that there's enough places where patient could potentially interact with that trial. So there's not, a clearinghouse answer to say, okay, this is, how it's going to look for all the trials, and these are the standard exclusions. Certainly some of the larger phase 3 trials that are out there are very much open to international participants. Now, there's some nuance to that around kind of the coverage for the routine medical care, which would be very similar to if someone internationally was trying to seek care in the United States, for example. So some of the things that happen on trial may be covered slightly differently. So there's some nuance kind of related to the nuts and bolts of the trial, but they wouldn't necessarily exclude international participants. Similarly, there's some trials that may exclude prior cancers by nature of the type of treatment that's being offered in the trial, but there are others that actually, there's at least one that I can think of off the top of my head, not an appendix cancer, but where they actually are looking for those who've had prior cancers. So this gets into where I think the complexity of trials can sometimes feel like, okay, how do I find that? And that's where I really encourage sitting down and many people already have done this, but what is the status of your condition? Where have things been up until now? What do the labs look like? Because oftentimes labs themselves are inclusion exclusion criteria for some trials. And then looking at some of the tools that are out there that are web-based, clinicaltrials.gov being a good one, because it really does get into the nitty-gritty of the inclusion exclusions of the trials and trying to match where you're at with those.
That's great. So it sounds like, yeah, don't assume because you have this in your history or this sort of lab, don't assume, oh, clinical trials are a dead end. Each one is very individual. So
yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah.
Great. Okay, good. And then just trying to jump around and watch our time. We still have time for a couple more. So immunotherapy, we get this one a lot too. So for specific mutations, I just want people to know, and this is on our repository, there is a trial by a company called Target, and the acronym for the trial is TRACK, TRACK, and that TRACK trial will identify potentially targetable mutations, and then it goes to a tumor board that then makes recommendations for potential clinical trials. So that's one thing. But Dr. Kothari, for you, do you have any kind of magic secret code thoughts on immunotherapy or as one of the questions that we got as part of the registration? We get it a lot, and there's a lot of frustration that although there are many KRAS trials, most of those are colorectal cancer, and they don't include appendix cancer as a cohort.
Yeah, this is something that I find to be very frustrating, honestly, which is so first and foremost, I think immunotherapy is something that we're just learning a lot about now. I think many of the splashes that we see in the news, in the media, and are in terms of major advances in cancer therapy usually are in some place along the way have immunotherapy as part of it. Now it's similar to chemo, where there's so many agents and so many different drugs, so it's hard to just say in a very black and white type of way, yes or no, this is going to work for this or that. But where I do find frustration right now is exactly that last point that you brought up, which is there are trials that are open for mutations that we do see in appendix cancer that currently don't have eligibility for those with appendix cancer. So they're KRAS G12 or certain subtypes, and you get screened and find out that that's actually thought of as exclusion. That's a little on us as a community, honestly. I think it's a marching order in some ways to a lot of these trials early on are pharma or driven by the drug company themselves, which is good. They can provide drug, and they're the ones that are kind of pushing these things forward, and we just got to get in their ears a bit. and I can assure you that I'm glad you can't see my face right now. I can assure you that I've gotten in the ears a bit because it makes no sense that we don't. We know that biologically there's so much overlap, and we shouldn't be screening out for appendix cancer in trials where there may be potential efficacy. So more to come, but just hear that a lot of us are thinking about exactly what that question was asking.
That's very, very encouraging. That's great. Thank you. And just one last question, because we always like to end on something super positive. Do you have any thoughts on what clinical trials, at least to date, have shown the most promise for appendix cancer patients? I mean, your presentation covered some of the real nuggets that prior clinical trials have uncovered and have led to treatments like CRS HIPEC. Anything else that you could share that's public or in the pipeline that you think is going on that have shown the most promise?
Yeah, I can tell you the things that I'm excited about and enthusiastic about. The first is from just a surgical standpoint. I think, the work that's being done at a couple of sites in the United States now, bringing pressurized and intraperitoneal aerosolized chemotherapy to those that we're treating, I think has really strong potential for helping, right now a very specific subgroup of individuals, but hopefully that can continue to be something that we can look at as an area that we're growing and developing in. So I'm enthusiastic and excited about the progress overseas, and very excited at the investigators that are championing it here in the United States. They're all tremendous people and surgeons, and they're, I think that they're doing all the right things to try to expand it safely to our community. KRAS, you've mentioned it, and increasingly we're finding new agents that target that pathway, and appendix cancer being a cancer that expresses mutations in that space. So I'm excited and enthusiastic about what that pipeline pharmacologically is going to look like. And you mentioned, I think it's Target. Now there's many different trials actually like that, which are using mutational profiles to match treatment based on either tumor board recognition or otherwise. And we have something similar here at our institution called iPredict. And I think that this idea of matched therapy is really important and gives me a lot of enthusiasm, not just in the kind of this salvage or advanced phase, but also early on in the treatment pathway to start saying, okay, let's not just give everyone the same thing. You have certain things that make you unique. Let's think about how that we can match that to you from the get-go.
Great. That's a lot of good promise out there. Thank you. So this is great. We are a little over time, so we'll need to wrap up. But Dr. Kothari, in doing so, do you have any closing thoughts, comments? I just want to thank you very much for all of your time and expertise.
No, I am so appreciative of being able to participate. I hope those who are able to hear this on recording, if they have questions, I put my email up originally, but it's AKOTHARI@mcw.edu. I'm always happy to talk about things. Know it's my email. I know that sometimes in the operating rooms, they don't expect an immediate answer sometimes, but I think all of us that treat this disease feel really strongly about helping the patients, not just those that are immediately in our vicinity, but across the country and the globe, and anything that we can do in the service of that, happy to help.
Great, terrific. Thank you, and thank you for all of your generosity of time and expertise. And there you are with your suit. You're on. Thank you so much. Okay, everybody, thank you for participating, for all the good questions, and have a good, safe holiday weekend. Okay, bye-bye.